Thank you very much, Karl-Heinz. Good afternoon to everybody in the room. It's very nice to be back. It's very nice to be back in the General Assembly of the AEBR. I have been with you before, last year and the year before, I think. As Karl-Heinz said, Anna Paula is sick, and although I normally do all the work, as you rightly say, she had actually prepared the presentation herself because I prepared for the workshop we had yesterday. We had shared the work, but nevertheless, she manages to give me all the work in any case. It's a little bit awkward because she had prepared the presentation, and it's therefore what she had in mind and what she wanted to share, and I'll try my best to represent that as closely, as faithfully as possible. The cohesion report, indeed. I will try to give you very briefly, some of the highlights of the report, but I would also then want to speak to you a little bit more about the other, I would call it more important document of the Commission that was published just before, which is the communication on border regions, since we managed to make sure that the communication on border region feed into the cohesion report, which was quite a tricky job, but we managed, and then a couple of ideas on post-2020. So the cohesion report, as you know, that comes out only every 3 years, so it's very much expected normally by stakeholders. This is what it looks like this year. And when I first saw it, I thought it was an advert for Vidal Sassoon. I couldn't really understand the symbolic of the cover, but and I still haven't understood it. But anyway, it's every 3 years, so it's really awaited with a lot of impatience. It's quite a deep, comprehensive analysis of the situation in the European Union, based on the last available data, and it looks really at economic, social and territorial trends in the 28 member states, just for those of you who are not necessarily so familiar with the report. And key highlights for this year's report: regional disparities across the 28 have decreased compared to 3 years ago, which is not such bad news. Employment level has improved globally, but you know that we had a severe crisis recently, and we are back to unemployment levels of pre-crisis. So we can't really say that we are making great progress on employment. We have just about recovered from the pre-crisis situation. And then one striking factor is also that there have been some significant movement in population across Europe, and some regions have really gained a lot of new citizens, and others have faced serious depopulation, and this is particularly true for border regions. I think most of you will not be too surprised by this. You can see on the map here, is this clear? I'm not sure, I don't know, from here I may be too close, but you can see from the map that indeed the more you go to the dark red, the more population you have lost. And it's a phenomenon which is very focused, of course, on Central and Eastern Europe, but also you can see the border between Portugal and Spain here, which is also in dark red in some areas and in orange. So globally, it's not the case for every border region, but globally, the trend is that many border regions have lost population. Unemployment, we know for sure now that the objective that we had in the Europe 2020 strategy will not be achieved. We have to accept that we will not create as much employment as we would have wanted, and the employment rate globally in Europe will not reach 75%. The increase in employment, which we have had, has been fairly marginal, as I said before, only 0.8 percentage point, which is actually very, very low. And if you look at the map again, you can see clearly that it is Southern and Eastern Europe that is really badly affected by very low employment rates. You can see where the employment is in Europe is in the green part of the map. So these were a couple of very general facts from the cohesion report that Paola wanted to share with you before moving more to the situation of border regions. I think the report, we should be happy, the report addresses border regions quite specifically in a few places. Here you can see the map of the existing border regions we have in both the land and the maritime border regions. The previous cohesion report kind of forgot a little bit about border regions, so we are quite happy now that visibility has been retrieved and that we talk about the issues in border regions. And here comes the connection to the other document that the Commission published in September. The Commissioner referred to it in her video message. Caroline's also referred to it. I think between them they probably stole most of my speech, and I have to find something else to say now. But we published a communication which focuses on land borders of the European Union and looks at what the issues are in those regions, which are not marginal, really. I mean, we talk in the conference about peripherality, but not every border region is peripheral. Border is not automatically synonym of periphery. You can see on the map here the border regions addressed by the communication, and some of them are actually not peripheral at all. They are capital cities, if you think of Copenhagen or Bratislava or Vienna, as the Commissioner mentioned. Some are really not peripheral, but some are very definitely peripheral, I would say, particularly where we are today. Together, they cover 40% of the territory, which is quite significant, and they host a third of the European population and produce a third of the European GDP. But generally speaking, again, the diversity in border regions is quite amazing. So what I say doesn't apply necessarily to each individual border region, but generally speaking, they are doing less well economically than the rest of the regions in the same countries. They are normally a little bit behind in terms of GDP and economic development. And what is also quite remarkable is that there is very generally also a lower access to public services in border regions. When we launched the communication here in September, I was quite struck by the fact that a colleague in DG Education and Culture mentioned that there were very few PhD universities in Europe, for instance, very few PhD universities located in border regions. And that's a sign, that your public services, including education, are less developed, or that the access to public services is more difficult. But whether they are more or less developed, whether access to public services is more or less present, what is common to all border regions is that life is invariably affected by complexities which are due to the fact that at least two national legal and administrative systems meet in border regions and in cross-border regions. And this leads to complexity I mentioned, but also to normally longer procedures than if you had to do the same procedure domestically, and more expensive procedure. Now, for those of you whom I have met before, you will be familiar with this because I already kept you informed of the work we were doing to research this communication. And already last year, I think, we mentioned some of these findings and these facts to you. What is new is we try to perform an exercise of quantifying the cost of these persisting obstacles along border regions. It was not very easy to do that. And I'm quite sure that maybe not every economist would agree with the quantification that we did, but that's how it is. You know, macroeconomics is a science that depends a lot on the models that you decide to use and to run. Nevertheless, we had enough data to try and run a model that showed that without doing anything, so if we continue business as usual, we are losing in border regions about 8% of GDP. We are losing. So what does that mean? It means that if we did something, and if we resolve all possible obstacles, we globally would be 8% richer in border regions. And this is actually quite a significant figure. Now, of course, you would tell me that it's not really realistic, and you are right, and it's probably also not desirable to remove all the obstacles, because some of them are, for instance, languages. And you don't want to remove, you don't want to make sure that everybody speaks English only. I mean, you want to promote multilingualism, but you will never have a situation where every European can speak in their own native language to every other European. That's not going to happen. So 8% is definitely not realistic, but we calculated that if we could tackle 20% of the existing legal obstacles, we could actually gain 2% for border regions across the EU, which is actually very significant. The map here, if it's clear for you, I hope it is, shows it quantifies the potential gains that you can get, and the darker you are on the map here, the darker you are, the more you have to gain from addressing border issues. Of course, the gains that you can make are proportionate to the level of interaction that you have across the border. If you have a border with a lot of interaction, like highly urbanized, many people, a lot of commuters, a lot of businesses working with each other, you can gain a lot. You can really make significant steps in terms of GDP and employment. And if you have borders where there are less people living there, there is less socioeconomic activity, of course the gains would also be a little bit lower. But nevertheless, even for the border where we are now, which is one of the most rural borders in Europe, the gains have been quantified. This is really unreadable, but between 0.8 and 2%. So it's not nothing. More importantly than this, the communication looks at what we should try to do and how we can really capitalize on removing border obstacles. So we propose in the communication a 10-point action plan, which has been mentioned earlier, and I want to stress what the Commissioner said, but also what Caroline said, is that there is, I think now, a real opportunity to do something, but we have to do it together. If the European institutions have to work alone on this, it is not going to work. If member states don't respond and don't pick up the ball, it's not going to work. If regions don't actually look at what they can do, and you are the regions actually, border regions, then it's not going to work. We really have to do this all together, because in the field of border issues, you are best placed to know that you feel the obstacle where you are, but the decision that needs to be taken to address the issue probably needs to be taken somewhere else. very often it will have to be taken in the capital city. And so we really need to have this multi-level governance and this dialogue, trialogue, or quadrilogue, whatever you want to call it, between the local level and the regional, national, and European level. And if we all decide that this is worth it, then I think we can do something. In the Commission, we are committed. The Commissioner said it, not only because we have adopted a document. To you, it might be just a 15-page document, but believe me, to us, it's more than that. It's a long process. It's a massive exercise of cooperation between different services of the Commission. We have to get the agreement of everybody before we can publish something like that. So it's not just somebody taking the pen, in this case my team and I, but it's actually really, there is a big machinery behind that. And you can also see that we are committed in the sense that we will establish a team in DG Regio whose job it will be to make sure that the 10-point action plan is implemented. We will have in the unit, which is already responsible now for cross-border cooperation programs, for the Interreg programs, we will have another team, partly the same, partly another team, working on the follow-up to this communication. Now, you are going to tell me what is it that you are proposing. I suggest that you read the communication because it's a short document. It's really easy to read, I think. I'm not sure about the translations. I think in English and in French and German it's very accessible. And I want to maybe highlight now a few points which are of more direct interest to you. Under the first point, which is called Deepen Cooperation and Exchanges, you will be very interested, I think, in two very concrete measures that will happen already in January 2018, so very soon. And one is that we will create an online platform for border practitioners and for border professionals. So we will have on the internet, of course we do everything on the internet these days, and it's actually very convenient for this type of exchanges. We will create a platform where we will definitely look for exchanges between us, between you, with cross-border institutions, AGTCs, Euro regions. The Commission will try to animate that, and we will try to foster a lot of exchanges. We will post there some of the good practices that we have uncovered during the research work for this communication, some of which is linked to Interreg. Interreg has financed a number of very interesting projects. Some is nothing to do with Interreg, not connected to Interreg. So we want to promote all of that and make sure that we exchange and talk and point each other to the right direction when there are solutions or inspiration that can be gained from what others have done. So this is one. And then the second initiative is we will launch a call for pilot projects. So you will be very interested in that. We will we don't have too much money, it's not a very big budget, but we think we can finance between 20 and 25 small, soft projects that will be open to public authorities which have a mandate to act in a specific border issue. And you will be able to apply. We will try to make the application as light as possible. And you would have to propose a new way for you to look at a particular issue that is important in your border region and how you would resolve it. And there will be a bit of seed money to finance some of the activities linked to that. So watch this space. We need to make the announcements in December and then the launch in January, and you will have a lot more information once this is all ready. At the moment it is still under development in our minds, but it will come very quickly. Then I also wanted to mention the multilingualism, again, something that has already been discussed earlier by previous speakers. You know, we really feel that multilingualism is essential in the work that we want to do and the work that you want to do, because it's very often the very first difficulty that you come across if you can't really talk to each other and communicate well enough. But it's more than that. It's also about learning about each other, because if you learn the language of your neighbor, you learn more than the language. You learn about their culture, about their ways and their habits and their customs. And it's so important if we are to live closer to each other and really gain from each other. We must promote this. So we will work ourselves with our colleagues in DG Education and Culture on what can be done with them. But here, I think, frankly, there is a big responsibility for regions and municipalities, because you can make a difference there. You can make a difference. Again, we will showcase some examples in the communication. We promote the France strategy that Saarland has, where they have the aim of making all the citizens of Saarland bilingual, and it's actually a best practice that we should all learn from. I wanted to mention facilitate cross-border accessibility as one of the actions. Again, extremely relevant when you are in this part of Spain. There are many border regions where local public transport simply is not effective enough across the border. There is a lack of integration of services, but there are also missing links, physical missing links to go from one side to the other. It's an ongoing work right now. We are mapping the missing links in the rail sector. You would be surprised to see how many discontinued rail lines there are across Europe. You know, rail lines that used to work perfectly fine 40 years ago, 30 years ago, and that have been discontinued. We really need to look at that again and revisit that, and then see how maybe European funding can play a role. I want to mention the provision of reliable and understandable information to citizens, because here too I think regions have a great role to play. There are obstacles that will never be solved. There are issues that will never change unless Europe changes dramatically. And that's not for tomorrow. Well, maybe not in the right direction for tomorrow. So when we have those obstacles, I think there is a clear responsibility for the regions, the municipalities, to work together to give their citizens the right information, correct, trustworthy information, so that they can make an informed decision about whether or not to go and work, for instance, on the other side of the border. Again, there are some very good examples with the InfoBest. We have Frederic here in the room. We have the Grenzinfopunten in the Dutch, German, Belgian border. Also, we have representatives here who can talk about that. And we want this needs to happen along many more borders. Healthcare, you know, healthcare. We mentioned it was mentioned here as well by the president of Extremadura. Healthcare in Europe, you can make so many. You can save so many lives by simply allowing citizens from country A to access the hospital which is closest to their home, which happens to be on the other side of the border. We don't do enough of that. We make some patients travel far too far away for treatment when there is actually a facility very close to home. Again, very good examples exist here and there in Europe. We want to promote them and help others do that. And then finally, the last point on build evidence for better decision making. I think here there have been some good examples at regional level of collecting data, you know, among border regions and municipalities to try and build a picture of the cross-border interaction that exists in different fields. We also need more of that, because the decision makers that you need the evidence, you need the information to be able to make your choices. and we lack that. We lack that very much. There are some portals, like in Luxembourg, you have a very impressive data portal that shows, for instance, movements of workers in the whole area around Luxembourg. We have one in the Upper Rhine as well. We would quite like to see a lot more of that. We will work on that on our side, because we have Eurostat, the European Statistical Office, working with the member states, but we can't do it all, definitely not. There also got to be regional initiatives in this field. So I just wanted to highlight those. I can talk forever on this, so I will take some discipline and stop now. I'm staying anyway today and tomorrow, and you can come and talk to me about this. This communication has been adopted now, so basically its implementation starts now. However, some of the proposals that I just mentioned are really long-term. They are not going to stop in 1 or 2 or 3 years. They are really for the more, that maybe 10, 20 years down the line. And so there must be a link between the communication that we have published and post-2020, and also some of the conclusions of the cohesion report should feed into the debate for the future of cohesion policy and Interreg. Unfortunately, the discussions on the budget have been delayed, and you know why. We didn't really expect Brexit a few years ago. It happened very quickly, and it's going to have a significant influence on the size of the EU budget, unless member states decide otherwise. But the UK alone takes with it about 15% of the EU budget. So either we live, the UK goes, but UK is a net contributor. Either we live with 15% less, or we find the 15% somewhere else, or we found not 15 but 10 or 5%. We don't know. We don't know how this is going to develop. And these are discussions well beyond this room, so let's not go into that. We won't really have the news on the budget for the next programming period before May next year, which makes it a little bit difficult to already put proposals on the table for cohesion policy, because you can't really do the same things if you have a budget which is cut in half, or if you have the same budget, or if you have an increased budget. So you can only think of what you would want to do, and you can maybe start thinking about implementation issues that you would need to address regardless of the size of the budget. So in the cohesion report, you will see a few proposals, like, for instance, simplifying dramatically the rules of cohesion policy by having a single set of rules. Let's see whether this can fly, but you know that at the moment each fund has its own rules. You will be familiar with that. It's sometimes incredibly complicated to abide by all the different rules, and it doesn't make much sense, so we would want to look at that. Cohesion policy budget will also depend a little bit on what our leaders want to do in terms of EU priorities, because there is a lot of talk about other types of priorities. I hear a lot talking about security, for instance. A lot of people want to invest in a proper European defense. If that's the case, the EU budget, if it's a bit smaller, you would want to share the cake differently from what it is now. So let's see whether that has an impact on cohesion. One way to not spend less would be, for instance, to increase the national co-financing rate. You could say, instead of giving 85% from the EU budget, 15% from the national, we do 60-40, 50-50, or whatever. I mean, that would actually keep up the budget. Even though, of course, the contribution would come from the member states or the regions. A lot of talk about keeping amounts of cohesion policy not allocated at the beginning of the period, so that you can respond to crises or challenges that suddenly appear, because blocking your money for 7 years as rigidly as we do now doesn't seem to make a lot of sense in a world that is really moving faster than it was 20 years ago. We would like to look at quicker implementation. It's still too slow. It still really doesn't work as it should. There's still too much time between a decision made on a program and the first money being spent, so we would want to look at that. And then simplification. Those of you who work in cohesion will know that we've been talking about simplification for a long time. We don't seem to know how to do that. I don't think anybody, I don't think it's the Commission only, also member states and regional authorities. Let's look at it this time. We had a high-level group working on that, and they came up with some more radical proposals than we would have done internally. And let's see how far we can take those ideas. So finally, what I wanted to conclude with is that for sure, I think also Karl-Heinz referred to it with the alliance that he mentioned, we want to continue to have a strong cohesion policy in Europe in the future because we want to continue to reduce disparities. And this is fundamental in Europe, that we want to offer opportunities, equality of opportunities to our citizens wherever they live. And the option to be able to stay and live and have a good life where they are born, this is actually quite essential. We want a future cohesion policy that promotes cooperation. And here I mean Interreg, yes. Sorry. I've had a sore throat for several days. To promote cooperation, and not only Interreg. This doesn't mean only Interreg. It also means we have to really start spending the EU budget on what we do best together when it brings added value, where we can actually invest in common projects. We have to really step up this. I think it's absolutely essential. Then, of course, stimulate investments. This is something that needs to continue. Investments are always needed. You are never finished with investing. You've invested in something, there are other things that come up. You have to invest in, you have to modernize. And if we want to develop a proper European, new European industry, we have to invest. And basically also, I think that's been made very clear by President Juncker, is be able to address new challenges much more effectively than we have in the past. And for me, that means being more flexible and open to changes and to risks as well. Voilà. In a nutshell, what I wanted to share with you on the cohesion report, on the communication, and the beginning of the process of thinking about post-2020. Thank you very much for your attention.